Chosen one, welcome, dearly beloved, anointed ones. Never laugh at the quiet one in the room. That's usually the person rewriting the whole story in their head. You see, it's funny how people love to judge potential by volume. The louder someone talks, the smarter they assume they are. Meanwhile, the real genius, the one who's actually observing, calculating, connecting dots unseen by the rest, gets labeled weird, off, or too deep. Until one day, the quiet one builds something no one else could even imagine. And suddenly, the whole town starts acting like they always knew you'd make it. But here's a fact. According to several psychological studies, highly intelligent people are often misunderstood early in life because their reasoning and emotional depth don't match the social tempo around them. In simple terms, you were never different. You were just decades ahead. Now, look at them. The same folks who once rolled their eyes at your ideas are out here reposting quotes that sound suspiciously like things you used to say. The same ones who mocked your dreams are now trying to remember if they ever supported you. Oh, the irony. Suddenly, everyone's rewriting history faster than Wi-Fi updates, and you can't even be mad about it. Because deep down, you knew this day was coming. This isn't just about success, it's about revelation, the divine plot twist, where the misunderstood genius finally becomes the mirror that exposes everyone's short-sightedness. So buckle up, because this story isn't about revenge. It's about realization. The kind that makes an entire town blush when they realize the one they laughed at is the one they should have learned from. Number 1. They mocked what they couldn't measure. That's the story of your life in one brutal sentence. You didn't fit into their small-scale understanding, so they called you strange. They thought you were slow because you didn't rush to speak. They thought you were lost because you didn't follow the crowd. But what they couldn't see was that your silence wasn't confusion. It was calibration. While they were busy trying to impress each other, you were studying the energy in the room. You were reading patterns, not people. You were understanding motives, not just words. You saw the whole game before they even realized they were pawns in one. People fear what they can't categorize. They're used to labeling things quickly so they can feel in control. And because they couldn't define you, they dismissed you. They mistook your calm for weakness, your humility for lack of intelligence. But your mind was never built for shallow applause. It was built to dismantle illusions. You were never meant to fit into the rhythm of small minds that need validation to feel alive. You were designed to function in divine timing, where understanding is deeper than noise. They only understood brilliance when it came with credentials, money, or fame. But your intelligence wasn't academic. It was experiential. It came from decoding pain, studying human nature, and seeing through masks people wear just to survive. You noticed details no one else did. You connected dots that didn't seem to belong together. That's the type of genius that can't be measured with grades or job titles. It's the kind that threatens people because it forces them to confront how little they actually know. And now, as your truth unfolds, they're standing there in quiet embarrassment. The same people who said you'd never amount to anything are now quoting your wisdom like they discovered it themselves. Their laughter has turned into awkward silence because your life has become the evidence they can't deny. They didn't just underestimate you, they miscalculated your depth. You were never behind. They were simply too shallow to recognize what depth even looks like. You didn't change. Awareness caught up. They mocked what they couldn't measure. And now they can't measure what you've become. Number 2, your genius didn't come wrapped in a degree. It came wrapped in pain. While everyone else was being praised for achievements and awards, you were surviving storms that would have broken most people. Your education didn't come from classrooms or certificates. It came from betrayal, loneliness, and the kind of heartbreak that teaches wisdom no textbook can hold. Every time life pushed you to your breaking point, your mind expanded. You learned to think beyond survival, to question everything, to see meaning where others only saw misery. That's the kind of brilliance that can't be taught. It's earned through endurance. You had to become your own teacher. While others had mentors, you had nights where you sat with your thoughts until they became lessons. You didn't have the luxury of comfort. Pain was your curriculum, and resilience was your degree. The irony is that the same people who laughed at your struggles now quote you for inspiration. They don't realize that what they admire in you today was forged in moments you wouldn't wish on anyone. You didn't study philosophy, you lived it. You didn't learn psychology, you survived manipulation and learned human nature firsthand. That's why your understanding runs deeper than theory. It's rooted in lived truth. Society has a strange way of rewarding surface knowledge while ignoring spiritual intelligence. They respect those who memorize information, not those who translate pain into purpose. But your genius isn't the kind that fits into systems. It breaks them. You think differently because you felt differently. You don't just know things, you understand them through empathy, through discernment, through the scars that rewired your entire perception. Every setback reshaped your mind into something more precise, more aware, more divine. Now that they see your light, they're confused about where it came from. They still think brilliance must come with a title or a position, but your crown was carved out of adversity, not authority. You don't have a diploma for it, you have proof of survival. That's what separates you. You didn't just go through pain, you mined it for meaning. And that's why your wisdom hits different. It's not borrowed, it's birthed. Your genius came through fire, not fortune, and that's why it's unshakable. Number 3, they were comfortable only when you were predictable. The moment you stopped acting how they expected, their comfort turned into confusion. They liked you better when you stayed small. When you played by the unspoken rules that kept them feeling superior. You were easy to handle when you blended in, when your brilliance was dimmed enough to make them feel safe. But the second you stepped into your full self, when your thinking started to challenge their limits, everything changed. They didn't know what to do with someone who refused to be defined by their assumptions. So they labeled you. They called you arrogant, rebellious, or strange. Not because you changed, but because your growth disrupted the false order they depended on. For a long time, you adjusted yourself to keep the peace. You held back insights, downplayed your talents, and softened your light, so no one felt threatened. But deep down, you knew it was slowly killing your spirit. You weren't born to be digestible. You were born to be transformative. The moment you stopped explaining yourself and started expressing yourself, they panicked. Their power over you depended on your predictability. When you stopped reacting the way they expected, they lost control. That's when the gossip started. That's when the rumors began. Because people always try to assassinate what they can't anticipate. They said you were acting different. But what they meant was, you stopped playing their script. You stopped apologizing for being wise. You stopped seeking approval from people who never understood you in the first place. The real reason they got uncomfortable wasn't because you changed too fast. It's because your evolution exposed their stagnation. When you outgrew the version of you they could manipulate, they realized they couldn't keep up mentally, emotionally, or spiritually. And that stung. Now that time has revealed who was truly growing and who was pretending, their tune has changed. Suddenly, the one they called too much is the one they quote. The one they said was crazy is the one they now consult. Your unpredictability turned out to be your protection. You stopped being their puppet and became your own person. They were comfortable only when you were predictable, but your freedom began the moment you stopped being predictable to anyone but God. Number 4, the same mouths that dismissed you are now rehearsing your language. The irony couldn't be more divine. These were the same people who once rolled their eyes at your way of thinking, who laughed when you tried to express deeper truths, who told you to stop overanalyzing or come back to reality. They couldn't comprehend your vision then, so they mocked it. But now, that same nonsense they once rejected has become their new vocabulary. They repeat your words like revelations, post your mindset like daily affirmations, and act as though they discovered the very ideas they once condemned. It's not respect, it's regret disguised as admiration. They used to call you too intense, too spiritual, or too emotional. You spoke with depth, and they mistook it for drama. You saw through illusions, and they labeled you negative. What they didn't understand is that your way of seeing the world wasn't about sounding wise. It was about surviving with awareness. You were living in truth, while they were living for image. They couldn't process your insight because it exposed the shallowness of their own understanding. They needed you to stay small so their logic could feel large. But now that your truth has unfolded in real time, they're left speechless. Or rather, they're left echoing your very words. They aren't quoting you because they finally get it. They're quoting you because time proved you right. And that's what hurts them most. The realization that what they mocked was divine intelligence disguised in simplicity. Now they scroll through your presence online, trying to decode the wisdom they once dismissed as madness. They steal your phrases, mimic your tone, and sprinkle your essence into their conversations, hoping no one notices. But deep down, they know. Every word they use is a quiet confession that you saw the truth before they did. You were never speaking nonsense. You were speaking prophecy in plain language. And while they were busy judging your tone, life validated your message. That's why they're sorry, not out of humility, but out of humiliation. They realize now that what they once rejected wasn't arrogance. It was anointing. And every time they repeat your words, heaven smiles, because what they meant for mockery has turned into ministry. Number 5, you didn't need validation. They needed correction. For years they thought their opinions mattered, that their judgment could define your worth. They assumed that if they dismissed you, you would shrink to fit their narrative. But your truth didn't rely on their approval. It was self-sustaining, unfolding on its own timeline, growing stronger and clearer with every passing moment. While they scrambled to keep up, your insight only deepened, proof that validation was never part of your equation. You didn't need applause or agreement. The world itself eventually had to acknowledge the weight of your clarity. When the truth you spoke years ago finally showed its strength, it hit them like a mirror reflecting what they refused to see in themselves. Shame replaced arrogance. The very words they laughed at, ignored, or ridiculed now echo as undeniable facts. And the irony is brutal. They weren't wrong to doubt because of ignorance. They were wrong because your understanding exposed the gaps in their own thinking. What they interpreted as rebellion or exaggeration was actually precision. Their confusion, pride, and fear of being revealed for what they truly were made them reject you. They weren't ready to handle a mind that saw through their illusions. Now they replay your old moments again and again, trying to reconstruct how they missed what was obvious all along. Every conversation, every comment, every subtle insight you shared years ago comes back to haunt them. They see themselves in the light you've always carried, unprepared, unwise, and incapable of comprehending a mind that wasn't meant to conform. Their rejection wasn't a measure of your worth, but a reflection of their limitations. You didn't need them to change their minds or to confess. Your life and your clarity did it for you. Over time, your words aged like prophecy because truth never loses its power. And as they finally absorb what they once dismissed, their shame is the soundtrack of correction. A correction they needed but couldn't face until you proved them wrong without even trying. Every look back, every whisper of regret only reinforces the fact that your validation was never theirs to give. Number 6. Your mind operated on a frequency they weren't spiritually tuned to hear. You were picking up signals their spirits weren't advanced enough to process. While they were focused on appearances, gossip, and quick conclusions, you were decoding energy, motives, and patterns that went far beyond the surface. You weren't trying to sound deep. You were simply speaking from a place they hadn't yet reached. Your insight came from a higher sensitivity, not intellect alone. It was spiritual intelligence, the kind that doesn't rely on logic, but on discernment. And because they couldn't understand the source, they mocked the sound. They mistook divine frequency for foolishness. They judged your tone because they couldn't handle your transmission. They heard the words, but they missed the message. When you spoke truth, it sounded like nonsense to people whose egos were louder than their spirits. They were too busy reacting emotionally to recognize that your insight wasn't criticism. It was clarity. You were warning them, guiding them, revealing what was unseen, but they only saw threat. To them, your perception felt invasive because it pierced through masks they thought were impenetrable. You weren't judging, you were discerning. You weren't predicting, you were perceiving what was already forming. But since they couldn't translate the language of spiritual depth, they labeled it crazy. Now, time has done what translation never could. It has proven you right. The things you sensed before anyone else are happening one by one. The people you warned others about are now showing their true nature. The shifts you spoke of are now visible in plain sight. They don't know whether to apologize or stay silent. So most just pretend they always knew. But the truth is they didn't know. You did. You were ahead because your spirit was attuned to a higher frequency, one that required humility to understand. They're haunted now, not because you changed, but because life has tuned them to your frequency. Too late. What once sounded strange to them now sounds like wisdom. What once made them uncomfortable now makes sense. You were never offbeat. They were just out of range. And now that your wavelength has proven real, they can't unhear what they once ignored. Number 7. They thought isolation would break you. It built your brilliance. When they pushed you out, they thought they were cutting off your power. They believed that by isolating you, they could silence your voice, dim your confidence, and make you doubt yourself. What they didn't realize was that solitude is sacred ground for a chosen one. You didn't crumble in the quiet. You evolved in it. While they were busy trying to erase your name, you were busy rewriting your destiny. Every moment of being overlooked, every season of being misunderstood, became the training ground for the kind of strength that doesn't need an audience to be real. They thought taking people away from you would leave you desperate. But instead of begging for company, you discovered your own company. You learned how to sit with your thoughts until they became revelations. You turned your pain into patterns and your loneliness into language that could speak to the soul. They thought silence would drive you crazy, but all it did was sharpen your mind until it became a weapon against illusion. You started to see through everything. The fake support, the masked intentions, the small-minded chatter. In isolation, your discernment deepened, and your vision became crystal clear. God used what was meant to destroy you as preparation. The silence they gave you wasn't punishment. It was programming. That's where the download happened. That's where your spirit got aligned with divine instruction. While they were talking, you were transforming. They were gossiping. You were growing. They were wasting energy trying to make you invisible. But that invisibility became your shield while your mind upgraded to another level. By the time you reappeared, you weren't the same person they left behind. Your wisdom didn't sound human anymore, because it wasn't coming from experience alone. It was coming from revelation. What they meant for isolation, God used for initiation. You were being initiated into a level of brilliance that requires stillness to access. They thought solitude would destroy your spark, but it became the fire that refined it. You walked out of isolation carrying insight that can't be taught, only birthed in silence. They thought they buried you, but you were actually being built. Number 8, they measured you by popularity instead of prophecy. They were so conditioned to believe that truth only matters when it's trending that they couldn't see the power in your quiet influence. The world has trained people to trust the crowd, not the calling. If something doesn't come with followers, fame, or noise, people assume it has no value. That's why they overlooked you, not because you lacked substance, but because your message wasn't wrapped in spectacle. They wanted numbers before they would believe in your mind. They wanted validation from the majority before giving credit to your vision. But what they didn't realize was that divine truth doesn't need marketing. It reveals itself over time. Chosen ones are not designed to trend. They are designed to transform. You were never meant to entertain the masses. You were meant to awaken them. But awakening rarely makes you popular at first because people don't like to be exposed to what they've been avoiding. Your insight didn't feed their comfort. It confronted it. You didn't say what sounded nice, you said what was necessary, and that's why they resisted you. They didn't reject your message because it was wrong. They rejected it because it was right too soon. They couldn't digest a level of truth that required them to evolve. You weren't made to fit the algorithm of public approval. Your words weren't meant for clicks. They were meant for correction. And correction never goes viral until people finally feel the consequences of ignoring it. Now that everything you warned them about is unfolding, they're starting to listen. They're realizing your weird ideas were actually warnings. Your unpopular perspective was preparation, and the voice they once mocked is the same one they now search for guidance. You see, prophecy doesn't attract attention, it demands awakening. That's why your journey took longer, why recognition came slower. You weren't being delayed, you were being preserved. God made sure your truth wouldn't become a trend because trends fade. But prophecy, real spirit-breathed insight, outlasts generations. They measured you by popularity, but heaven measured you by purpose. And now the very wisdom they ignored is the same wisdom they can't live without. Number 9, your brilliance was a threat to their collective comfort zone. You didn't just disrupt one person's ego. You rattled an entire system built on pretending. Small-minded people depend on sameness to survive. They draw safety from the familiar, even if it's false. The moment someone like you walks in with awareness, truth, and a higher standard, you automatically expose the imbalance in their world. Your presence alone became confrontation. You weren't trying to prove anything, but your way of thinking forced them to see how shallow their own logic had become. You didn't insult them. Your excellence did. You see, mediocrity is a culture. It's built on unspoken agreements. Don't think too hard. Don't dream too big. Don't speak too boldly. Everyone plays along to maintain peace. But when you came in and broke those unspoken rules, it shook their false sense of normal. They couldn't handle how naturally you did what they struggled to fake. So they united against you, not because you were wrong, but because your truth revealed how much of their identity was performance. They said you were too much, too confident, or too different. But those were just code words for too real. It was never personal. It was protection of their illusions. People who live off validation can't stand someone who lives off vision. Your presence forced them to confront everything they'd been avoiding: their lack of purpose, their insecurities, their unwillingness to evolve. It's easier to reject what challenges you than to face what it exposes. That's why entire groups joined in the gossip, the whispers, the rejection. It wasn't about you as a person. It was about keeping their fragile ecosystem intact. You were too awake in a room that preferred to stay asleep. But here's the twist. What they saw as a disruption was actually divine recalibration. Your brilliance wasn't chaos. It was correction. You didn't come to destroy their comfort. You came to reveal its cost. And while they fought to preserve mediocrity, you were busy mastering growth. They feared you because you proved that greatness isn't loud. It's unsettling. You didn't just break their comfort zone, you exposed how small it truly was. Number 10. What they called overthinking was actually divine pattern recognition. They couldn't understand the way your mind worked because it didn't operate on the surface. It moved through layers, connections, and invisible threads that most people never notice. They mocked the way you processed everything so deeply, acting like you were exhausting yourself with imaginary problems. But what they failed to see is that your depth wasn't dysfunction, it was discernment. You weren't stuck in your head. You were tuned into a higher level of awareness that demanded attention. You noticed small shifts in people's tone, patterns in their timing, inconsistencies in their energy. You saw what others ignored because you were wired to see the story behind the story. They laughed and told you to stop overthinking, but what they really meant was stop noticing. Your mind scared them because it connected dots that threatened their illusions. You weren't just observing behavior, you were decoding motives. You could sense when something didn't add up, when energy didn't match words. You could predict outcomes not because you were psychic, but because you understood patterns, emotional, spiritual, and situational. And that ability to see ahead made people uncomfortable. They wanted to believe you were imagining things because if you weren't, it meant they were exposed. They called it paranoia because it was easier than admitting you were right. But time has a way of revealing the truth. The same people who dismissed your insight now find themselves remembering the warnings you gave, the gut feelings you voiced, the odd little details you pointed out that turned out to be spot on. What they once mocked, they now replay in disbelief. They're realizing you weren't dramatic, you were accurate. Your brain was never chaotic, it was simply operating beyond their comprehension. Now that the truth has surfaced, they're left embarrassed. The label of overthinker no longer fits because the evidence is undeniable. You were never lost in thought. You were guided by divine intelligence. That's why your clarity often felt heavy. It wasn't coming from logic alone. It was coming from a spiritual download. You weren't paranoid. You were precise. And every moment they doubted you only proves how ahead you truly were. Number 11. Your exile was a stage for revelation, not rejection. Your exile was never a punishment. It was preparation disguised as distance. They thought your silence meant defeat, but that period of isolation was the most productive season of your soul. You weren't just away, you were being upgraded. While they assumed you'd lost relevance, God was fine-tuning your spirit for revelation. The space they created by rejecting you became sacred ground for transformation. You were stripped of noise, opinions, and validation so that your mind could finally align with divine instruction. Every unanswered call, every closed door, every lonely night was part of the formatting process. You were being cleared of old data, limited beliefs, toxic attachments, and emotional clutter so that your spirit could handle the higher voltage of divine wisdom. They laughed at your disappearance, but what they didn't know is that chosen ones don't vanish. They regenerate. Exile was the womb where your next version was being formed. God hid you not because you were unworthy, but because revelation cannot grow in public soil. Some lessons are too sacred for the crowd. They can only be received in silence. You weren't being isolated, you were being initiated. That's why when you reemerged, you spoke with a kind of clarity that didn't sound learned. It sounded lived. Your wisdom didn't come from books or mentors. It came from survival, from surrender, from sitting with God in the dark until light began to speak through you. Now, the same people who once pitied your absence can feel that something supernatural happened while you were gone. They can't explain it, but they can sense it. Your presence feels charged. Your words carry weight. Your energy has authority. They thought rejection would break you, but it became the perfect hiding place for your rebirth. You were never behind. You were being concealed until your frequency was too refined to be misunderstood. Your exile wasn't the end of your story. It was the divine pause before revelation. And when you returned, you didn't come back to prove them wrong. You came back carrying something they can't intellectualize. Wisdom that wasn't taught. It was downloaded directly from the source. Number 12. Their apologies are not from conviction, but from exposure. Their apologies came late, not because their hearts evolved, but because the truth could no longer be hidden. When you were unseen, your genius was a joke. But the moment the world began to recognize you, those same people scrambled to rewrite history. Suddenly, the ones who mocked you are so proud of you. The ones who dismissed you are telling stories of how they always knew you'd make it. But beneath those smiles is the sour taste of exposure. They're not repenting, they're reacting to the loss of control. They can't stand that your light revealed how blind they were. Their apologies sound polished, but they're hollow. You can hear it in their tone. It's not sorrow, it's strategy. Because genuine remorse changes behavior, but their behavior hasn't changed. Only the audience has. They don't regret mistreating you. They regret that others can now see it. Their shame didn't come from revelation, it came from reputation. It's the kind of guilt that appears when public opinion shifts and hypocrisy becomes traceable. The very people who swore you were delusional are now curating ways to be connected to your success. It's not humility, it's damage control. And that's the twisted brilliance of divine justice. It exposes hearts without you ever needing revenge. You didn't have to announce your worth. The results did. God used your growth as a mirror, and now they can't unsee their reflection. The truth is, they always knew you were different. They just couldn't afford to admit it when everyone else agreed to doubt you. Now that your light is undeniable, they're forced to face what they suppressed. They mistook holiness for arrogance and authenticity for rebellion. Their apologies are not born from conviction, but from exposure. And that's fine, because you never needed their validation to begin with. You were built in silence, vindicated in truth, and elevated without their permission. Let them perform repentance while you perform purpose. Time has already rendered its verdict, and it's poetic. What they refused to acknowledge privately, life made them bow to publicly. Number 13. You became the proof that genius is not always recognized. It's revealed in time. You became the living proof that genius doesn't need applause to exist. It simply waits for time to catch up. When they couldn't categorize you, they called you crazy. When they couldn't understand you, they called you lost. But the truth is, you were never behind. You were ahead. Your silence wasn't a sign of defeat. It was incubation. While they were chasing attention, you were cultivating depth. And that's the thing about divine timing. It hides brilliance until the world is humble enough to receive it. You didn't need to convince anyone you were chosen. Time did that for you. What they mocked as failure was really the forming of something they couldn't fathom. Every misunderstanding became fertilizer for revelation. Every delay trained your patience until your wisdom carried the weight of experience, not ego. You were never meant to be understood instantly. Chosen ones rarely are. Your journey had to mature in silence so that when the truth finally spoke, it couldn't be denied. That's why your rise feels so poetic, because it wasn't random. It was right on schedule. Now the same voices that once dismissed you are echoing your thoughts, using your language, and quoting your essence. They don't even realize they sound like you. That's how deep your influence has reached. You became the reference point they once ridiculed. They mocked your ideas and now they mimic them. They laughed at your principles and now they package them as wisdom. The irony is divine. The nobody they overlooked became the blueprint they now depend on for relevance. You never needed to prove you were right. All you had to do was endure until revelation caught up with reality. And now, as your truth unfolds publicly, they're realizing what they once rejected was never arrogance, it was foresight. Genius doesn't announce itself, it simply exists until time reveals its value. And now that your time has arrived, the whole town is standing in quiet embarrassment, watching the prophecy they ignored become the proof they can no longer deny. Number 14, their shame is the sound of divine reversal. Their shame isn't random, it's the echo of divine justice catching up with arrogance. The same people who once mocked your steps are now tiptoeing around your name. What they dismissed in public, they now secretly study in private. That's how divine reversal operates. It doesn't just lift you, it humbles those who laughed while you were still being built. Their laughter once filled the air, but now it's their silence that testifies. The joke turned into judgment, and the rumor became reverence. You didn't have to argue, prove, or retaliate. Time became your courtroom, and truth became your witness. Divine reversal is poetic like that. It takes mockery and molds it into manifestation. Every insult they threw became a seed for your recognition. Every attempt to bury you became soil for your growth. They thought your downfall would confirm their superiority, but your rise became the sermon they never wanted to hear. Now they're not laughing, they're learning. The same mouths that cursed you are now praying to be connected to you. It's not coincidence, it's correction. Heaven never lets humiliation go unrewarded when it's endured in silence. You see, God doesn't expose people with lightning bolts. He exposes them through outcomes. That's why their shame stings so deeply. It's not punishment, it's realization. They're being forced to face the truth they ignored. That what they laughed at was actually sacred. That what they mocked was prophetic. That what they abandoned was chosen. And now they have to live with the uncomfortable awareness that they mishandled what heaven had marked. Their shame is the sound of divine reversal, the quiet hum of heaven restoring balance without violence. It's not about revenge, it's about revelation. You didn't need to make them see. Life did it for you. And now every success you experience plays like a divine announcement that says, the proof has arrived. Not for their destruction, but for your vindication. Because sometimes the most powerful judgment isn't wrath. It's watching the tables turn so gracefully that even your enemies have no choice but to clap. Amen.